Okay, now for the next session, we have a keynote speech by Professor. We have invited and we are very grateful to the Professor Dibyesh Anand from University of Westminster for accepting our invitation to give the keynote speech for today, this particular international workshop about Tibetan in exile, Uyghur diaspora, and Hong Konger refugee in Taiwan. So before I invite Professor Dibyesh Anand to give the speech, I just quickly read his a short introduction, those who are not familiar with the professor. So Professor Dibyesh Anand is the head of School of Social Science, University of Westminster, London. And he is also the co-chair of University's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and as well as the Black and Minority Ethnic Network Committee, and elected as the nominee for staff governor for the university's Court of Governance. So may I request Professor Dibyesh Anand to start your speech.
Hello to everyone. I wish I could have joined for the entire day, but as you'd all have seen, the time difference implies that for me it was still very early morning. And what Dolma didn't refer in my bio, the reason why I'm here is not because I'm head of School of Social Science or I have all these roles within the university. They are not relevant for you. The reason I'm here, and Dolma knows it, and some of you may know, others may not, is I've been working on issue of Tibet in particular, Tibet and China for last 25 years. But I've also written about Uyghur and similarities and differences vis-a-vis the Uyghur issue and Tibetan issue for the last few years. And in terms of Hong Kong also, I would say myself, and I can see some of you here. So we are preaching to the converted. So we would be among the few academics who do not shy away from activism. So for many years, in my role as professor in other places, always have sought to provide platform for activists, platform for exile groups to speak against what is Chinese colonialism. So that's the reason I'm here. So again, thank you for inviting me to do this. Said I wish this was in person. I'm a more in-person person. Until 2 years ago, I used to think I'm more an online person, but in 2 years' time, I realized no, I'm more an in-person human being, because the kind of engagement we get there is quite different. But let me start by saying why this is significant. Now, first, even the location of the seminar, while it's online, it's in Taiwan, right? It's being hosted in Taiwan is significant. It's significant because, of course, Taiwan with its own contested history vis-a-vis China, is it the real China or is it the other China? Does it want independence? Does it want to, have integration or whatever? There's a debate. But the fact of the matter is, the moment we say Taiwan, what triggers in Beijing is a fear of further separatism, according to Beijing. What it tells us is about that basically Taiwan has historically been part of Chinese colonization. So the fact that people of Taiwan, the indigenous people of Taiwan, had been marginalized, minoritized, and you had migrants from mainland who then become the dominant, it reminds you that Taiwan has been a product of and a victim of Chinese colonization for a long time. But even today, regardless of whatever view you have about Taiwan vis-a-vis China, independence or not independence, from Chinese government perspective, it is a colonial project that's incomplete. And it can only be complete once Taiwan is integrated with motherland. Right? So in that sense, the location of the talk itself is significant, because what Tibetans have experienced and Uyghurs have experienced for many decades under PRC and even before that is what Hong Kong people are experiencing now, and what Taiwan people will experience or likely to experience until and unless Chinese colonial state is sort of pushed back against. So I thought the significance, as many scholars have pointed out, I heard only last one session, the ways in which, of course, we know that causes, be it the cause of Hong Kong, Uyghurs, or Tibetans, they are weaponized by different countries. So US became, Tibet was a key issue for them in 1960s. Then they dropped Tibet in 1970s. Then Tibet became very hot in 1990s. Then they dropped Tibet again. Uyghurs are the special ones right now. When I say special ones, you can see the sarcasm in my tone. When I say special one, it doesn't mean that there's actual care. It is more about using Uyghur cause not only vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis other Muslim states to tell them that, look, you want to talk about Palestine, you want to talk about Kashmir, what about Uyghurs? So when we look at not all, the governments and the politicians who often express support for Uyghurs, some of it might be concerned with human rights, but much of it concerned is not with human rights, but with other factors. And that's a big risk we have, right? Because if one becomes dependent on them, what may happen is what also happened to the Kurdish people at one point in time, where US used them and then they dropped them when it became inconvenient. And that's how the states operate. So in terms of because you do in your seminar talk about refugees, exiles, and diasporas. I was wondering about the different term used for all three, right? But anyway, what you'd have in the West broadly, I'm talking of the West, or even other countries, is initial welcome. Oh, poor Uyghurs, they're suffering. Let's have them in Turkey. Poor Uyghurs, US will not give refuge, but Tibetans, give them refuge in Canada or wherever, in India at one point in time. But very soon it leads to exhaustion. Okay, we have too many Uyghurs, we have too many Tibetans. Not too many, but the cause is no longer a cause. So then there's an exhaustion. So if you take example of India, so India, when it started hosting Tibetans from 1959, 50s onwards, after first couple of decades, by now, regardless of what the Indian government says, the attitude broadly in India is, yes, we respect the Dalai Lama. That's it, full stop. But if we have another Tibetan movement, which is not possible because of Chinese control, in India, you'd find almost to an extent hostile reception. So what I'm saying, there's an exhaustion also that sets in with all refugees. But, and this is something we have to be aware in universities, is also domestication of it. So for instance, whether you're a professor in England or Turkey or France or in India, we always have to ask, what are the costs we have to bear if we keep talking very politically about Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kong people, right? Now, do our fellow academics, do they like the fact that we talk of these oppressed people, or would they prefer that we only talk of human rights and not self-determination? So in my experience, and I've done my own analysis for the last 25 years, is in Indian Western academy, which I'll refer to with Tibet, but also Hong Kong, there was first an interest in the issue, then trying to say, oh, we want to talk about a Hong Kong person who experienced it, but we don't want to talk about Hong Kong politically. There's almost a fear in academia to talk of politics on the issue. So no talk of self-determination, only human rights. And then gradually, no talk of human rights, only talk of culture. And the reason I mention this is because that is a domestication of all these issues, right? So in that sense, the title that you had, resilience, resettlement, resistance, they are the crucial ones, because how can these exiled, refugee, diasporic groups survive, flourish? So survival is about resettlement, then it's about resilience, and then of course it's about resistance. How can they survive while being exiles, but also then resist the original status? And that's a big challenge. Now, how to resist, of course, in the face of rising China is even more difficult. So if you take example, you'd be familiar, is the fact that China is a rising superpower. We can talk of, again, some of you might not be that old compared to what I am, right, is I recall a decade ago, a conference in Dharamshala, and we had Gordon Chang coming and speaking about the coming collapse of China. And large number of Tibetan political leaders and the government in exile people were quite excited and hopeful. Oh, there will be a coming collapse of China. Now, and I was there as a scholar and as an intellectual. I did feel that was a naive expectation, or the expectation was that Xi Jinping, when he came to power, there was a discussion in Dharamshala that because Xi Jinping wears a watch that is gifted to his father by the Dalai Lama in 1950s, somehow Xi Jinping will be more open. And there was a serious discussion. And I'm sure that with Uyghurs and Hong Kong people also, there would be some who would have those kinds of hope. That's fine. But there have been also more established scholars, not Gordon and Chang kind of people who will talk of collapse of China, which is great if it collapses, but that's how this talk and the presented was. Also of how Communist Party will split by 2020, 2022. Now, for those of us who have experience of age, that's almost like amusing that, okay, so now we have 2022. Is anyone else talking about collapse of China, collapse of Communist Party? Same scholars who talked of Communist Party of China splitting into two, by the way, by 2022. These are prominent China studies scholars. Again, I'm not naming them here, but if you read them, possibly you're reading their work, but you'd think that they're experts. And there's no acknowledgement that they were wrong 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The reason I highlight this is, of course, because the key thing which we all have to acknowledge, those of us who are Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, but also those of us in solidarity with them, is that we are in for a long game. If you use the word game, and it's not appropriate, game. Long game in the sense that we are talking China, that's very powerful. With all the challenges it's facing, it's unlikely to collapse. It's unlikely to, it might get weak. It's unlikely to wake up tomorrow and then say, oh, it's too expensive. Let's give more autonomy to Hong Kong. Let's not have concentration camps for Uyghurs. Let us allow the Dalai Lama to come back. That's unlikely. So now, how do these movements, the three people we are talking about, how do we resist in the face of rising China? Now, part of the problem vis-a-vis India, Turkey, the Western countries, and wherever, the groups come out, is, as I said, sympathy can be partial and temporary. So I always, my Uyghur friends know it, and I'm part of the left progressive support movement for Uyghurs also. I also try to remind them, just look at what's happening to Tibetans. Where is the Tibetan cause? Now, internationally, I mean, right? Tibetan cause is still there, but it's shrinking. And you think, but are Uyghurs experiencing something more? And this is the challenge, right? Rather than thinking, oh, Uyghurs are getting attention, not Tibetans, or Hong Kong people are getting attention, not Uyghurs, we have to acknowledge the problem is the same one, similar one, and the source of the problem is the same one. So problems are similar, and the source of the problem is the same one. And that's something we have to work towards, right? So how to resist in the face of rising China, given that there's partial and temporary sympathy, tokenistic solidarity? So in India or Western context, you'll have generally the right-wing politicians who are anti-China who'd express sympathy. Right now, notice in Indian context. In Indian context, generally, I mean, of course, that a significant section of far-right Hindu nationalists will express some sympathy for Tibetans, but they'll never express sympathy for Uyghurs. They'll only express for Uyghurs to say, oh, what about Pakistan? Why doesn't it not support Uyghurs? That's the only time they'll do it. Otherwise, they won't. So someone like myself, who speaks in solidarity with movements of, self-determination, be it of Kashmiris, Tibetans, Baloch, Kurds, Palestinians, I become very inconvenient. So on Tibet, I would be liked by many in India, but on Kashmir, no. And vice versa. Those are things we face. So I do feel that we need to go beyond talking in solidarity. There's a skepticism in the left or progressive circle. Generally, the left and progressive would be the ones who are anti-imperialist, anti-colonial. And yet there's a skepticism because they would see it as a Western ploy, that somehow if you support Uyghurs. So on social media, where I'm quite active, what I find is on Uyghur issue, whenever I would write about it, or Tibetan issue also, the leftist friends of mine, including Muslim leftist friends of mine, would almost react by saying that, oh, but this is a conspiracy, this is a Western propaganda. And when I say leftist and Muslim leftist, and also Muslims who are not leftists, a large number of them would deny, and I'm talking of course, Muslims, I mean, in this context, the Kashmiri, Indian, and Pakistani context, who are often connected with me. They deny the genocide, they deny the human rights abuse of Uyghur by saying it's a propaganda of the West. Now, this is what we're facing. So left, progressive, and other skepticism and hostility also. The second challenge will be Chinese influence. As one of you earlier was talking of, Chinese influence is not only economic, it's very political. They work vis-a-vis government, they work in media, they work in academia here. So for instance, you try to organize, I mean, imagine if I had to organize it, okay, I can manage at my university because of my position, and I've been doing that for many years. And our university is very strongly committed to academic freedom. But I'm aware of many of my fellow scholars in the UK who'd avoid coming to something that's very political. So they will try to say, oh, let's have discussion in Hong Kong, but can we not invite activists? Let's have a discussion on China and Uyghurs, but let's not invite any Uyghur activists. So we experience that in everyday here level. So at this point in time, Uyghurs don't feel that in UK, but I can say when I look at what's happening with Hong Kong and what's happening with Tibetans, that Uyghur scholarship or scholarship on Uyghurs will face similar kinds of challenges, right? So Chinese influence, and the key Chinese influence is about also, and I use the word weaponization of hurt. So the idea that, oh, if you say anything about Uyghurs or Tibet, the first reaction is, oh, I didn't know. Second, but my sentiments are being hurt. So if you have a significant section of Chinese students and some scholars in the West, where they'll be quite, and if they say, oh, but if you're talking of Uyghur issue or Hong Kong issue, you're hurting my sentiments, it immediately leads to, oh, you're being racist. You're being insensitive. So what does cultural sensitivity within university mean? That you should not talk about Chinese colonization. I use the word colonization here. So every event I have had on Tibet and China and Uyghurs and others at my university, sometimes you'd have people from Taiwan speaking loudly. Then you'd have some from mainland China saying, oh, I did not know it. Then some from it saying that, but that's a different view. And then some saying that my sentiments are being hurt. Now, the sentiments are being heard is fine. Our individual sentiments can be heard, but they speak in the name of the wider collective. So what the Chinese government and the media and increasing number of overseas Chinese do is they weaponize hurt to prevent any kind of honest conversation, discussion on Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibetans, or for that matter, even China itself. So you have an odd situation where 1.3 billion people are meant to have one national sentiment which gets hurt if you have a conference on Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kong. And we know that's not the reality of hurt. It's a weaponization of hurt. So what I would, and then I'll take 5 minutes and then end you for question answers. It's important, and my suggestion would be a way out, of course, is solidarity. So I'm glad, Dolma, you and others have organized this. It's very important that we continue to do it. Rather than compete with each other, we work together. As scholars, activists, community organizations, while acknowledging there would be differences. To acknowledge there is a common problem. The common problem is not Communist Party of China per se. The common problem, I would say, is colonization. Chinese colonization in this context. That basically what the three people have faced, and what other people may face is explicit colonization. And I use the word colonialism. I am not saying internal colonialism. So in one of the articles I wrote for Central Asian Survey, if you're interested, you can check out. You just Google my name, Dibyesh Anand, China, Xinjiang, Tibet, or China, Uyghurs and Tibet. So I call it colonization with Chinese characteristics. I'm typically using what's in a social with China. I say it's a colonization of Chinese characteristics. And I argue that it's not internal colonialism, because internal colonialism implies that China has a legitimate claim over Uyghurs and Tibetans. Now, you may have that view, but if you take the perspective of many Uyghurs and many Tibetans or Hong Kong people, then China doesn't have a legitimate claim. So my argument as a scholar would be that rather than privilege the view of the powerful, in this case Beijing, we should privilege the view of the powerless or those with less power, Uyghurs, Tibetans and others. And therefore, if Uyghurs and Tibetans are saying that we are facing genocide, we are facing XYZ, we have to respect that view, whatever you think. So in my work, what I say is, and I critique scholarship on internal colonialism, say it's not internal colonialism, it's full-fledged colonization. And I'm saying colonization because of colonization involves political control, territorial control, economic control, changing the society. It involves knowledge control. So everything that's written about, spoken about Uyghurs, Hong Kong and Tibetan has to be controlled by the government, right? So what you have, of course, is that I'll give example of Tibetans, for instance, that Tibetans cannot be Tibet. It's China's Tibet. Then Tibet has always been part of China. Historically, it's part of motherland. There's territorial control. And every Tibetan has to always be grateful to Beijing. Uyghurs also, every Uyghur in propaganda of Chinese government is always smiling and happy, right? They're very colorful people, always happy and thanking central government. Now, the point of the matter is, and Hong Kong is slightly different, but that's the direction we are moving in. So the fact is, territorial, political, economic, social control over knowledge. And those of us who have studied Edward Said, Orientalism, we are familiar that imperialism always goes hand in hand with knowledge production. And if you look at China's colonization over these people, it goes hand in hand with knowledge production. Now, of course, they can't control knowledge being produced in India, Turkey, Taiwan, or Western countries. They will try to influence it, but they do control 100% knowledge production in China, right? Produced about these people. So it's about knowledge production. And remember one thing, violence. Violence is at the very heart of colonization. So violence, we can see at every level, violence is used. The national security law in case of Hong Kong, it's a colonial law. The fact that, of course, British were colonial doesn't mean Chinese are not colonial. Both of them are colonial. That's the whole point. So when I say China is a colonial state, I'm not saying, therefore, Western colonialism is bad, good, not so bad. What I'm saying is China is an exact mirror copy of Western colonization, the way many other states are, right? I've worked in India or Kashmir also, but that's not the focus. China is a colonial state. It might have been a victim of colonization one point in time, but today it is a practitioner of colonialism. That's the reality. And one final thing on colonization. Colonization is also about paternalism. It's not only a political control. It is about telling you, oh, Uyghur people, you can't survive without us, so we will help you. Tibetans, we are always helping you out. Why are you ungrateful? Hong Kong deserves us. You need us. So paternalism is very much, and patronizing is part and parcel, and demographic control, all of that. So, right, there's a colonizing. So I do think, and I'll conclude with this, is we do need to acknowledge the elephant in the room, or the dragon in the room, or whatever, tiger in the room, or whatever you want to call it, right, is basically Chinese colonization. So one way in which we can make sure resilience, resettlement, resistance of all these group functions to acknowledge colonization and phrase it as colonization. And I can tell you why phrase it colonization, because that's the reality. What people are facing is colonization. Second, there are anti-colonial norms and rules. So once we phrase it and push it that this is a colonization, there are anti-colonial norms. There's also, it challenges the false dichotomy between human rights or self-determination. Sometimes people say, oh, but the struggle for Uyghurs is human rights, not self-determination. If you talk self-determination, then you're terrorist, etc., etc. My point is, Uyghur people are having human rights problems because they don't have self-determination. And they don't have self-determination because, and that's connected to humans. So both of them are very closely connected. So phrasing it as colonization and is essentially allows us to struggle for both self-determination and human rights. It challenges false dichotomy. It allows for more solidarity between the groups. It allows for more solidarity building between these three and also other colonized and occupied people. And essentially it exposes China for what it is, which is being a colonizing state. And finally, it allows us to work towards decolonizing China. Because if you're talking of decolonizing West, decolonizing the world, and at least in UK, US context, there's a whole movement for decolonizing, which is great. I said, we can't talk of decolonizing the West, but not decolonizing the non-Western powers. Given that non-Western powers such as China, India, many other powerful states, right, are practicing colonization. So I'll end by reminding us and thanking all of you for giving the opportunity, but remind us that there's hope. The hope is if you look at long-term colonization, they do finish. They do get over. No empire survive forever. Therefore, what we need to do is build solidarity, work towards, recognize the problem for what it is, and work against that, because the only good scholarship, in my view, is a scholarship that supports and has solidarity with those with less power than scholarship that massages the ego of those who already have power, in this case China. Thank you so much.